All right, let's go ahead and get started. I guess everyone's done trickling in for the most part. So I'm here today to talk about web platform primitives that we think are useful for web developers on a new set of form factor that Microsoft has been looking at launching. So about a month ago, we announced support for two new devices, one called the Surface Neo, which is more of a tablet form factor, one called the Surface Duo, which is more of a phone form factor. One of these happens to run on a flavor of Windows, and the other is actually running on Android. But the web is available on both, and so we think that can be really the go-to platform that developers can target to get these enlightened content and experiences to these new devices. So what do we mean when we talk about enlightened experiences? Here's just one example of a map app where on one side you have a list view and your map is kind of spanned across both of the screens by default. But we think developers might want to provide an experience where there's more real estate for the list, and your map is not split across the screens, and it's a more natural interaction. There's kind of a number of other design patterns and use cases that we've been looking at exposing. So you can imagine you have your master list of emails and a detailed view of those. Some other examples are where you have content on one side and maybe you're controlling aspects of that content with the other screen. And the thing to emphasize here is we really do think this is kind of a new modality of computing where generally you have one app on one side, another app on the other side, but there's also this mode where the window manager, due to users' input, can end up spanning an app across both screens. And in that case, we believe apps/websites should be able to respond accordingly. So we've kind of come up with a set of principles that we've been working through as we're looking at these. The first one is that existing sites just work, but they can opt into Enlightenment. Some of the fundamental assumptions there are that sites expect a single rectangular viewport. We're not really trying to invent anything new in terms of multiple user agent defined regions. The other bit is that one of the principles, following that principle, we want no loss of information for sites that are not enlightened. This can be like if you have text that would normally span the gap, we don't want that to be hidden from users so that they can actually see all the content that the site expected them to be able to see. Following that, we think there needs to be a common pattern for developers so that they can reason about this new state. So we think the site should be able to configure expectations around whether or not how the gap is treated, whether pixels are nominally displayed underneath it, or if they want this split view when they're enlightened. And we also think that developers should be able to get consistent data and be able to reason about the coordinates or postures or window state that we expose. And they also need to know when these things change. And thirdly, there's kind of future looking. This is kind of a new area that we're exploring. We believe that there will be new form factors that come out that might be a little bit more exotic. And we're trying to kind of find the right level of abstraction between maybe exposing basic hardware versus something a little bit higher level that kind of conveys more semantics. So you can imagine like hinge angle as a sensor versus maybe something more semantic, like you're in a book posture or a tent posture or something like that. And we believe that these things are kind of going to evolve as we have these web standards proposals and get feedback from developers on use cases, and as the devices come to market, having people play with it and understand how they might bring scenarios that they're thinking of to their users. So following those principles, there's kind of a few API considerations that we've been looking at. The first one is, as I previously mentioned, this split versus masking. What do you do when your window is spanned? And again, I think the principle there is by default, you would want to split, but there are some cases where you actually might want pixels to be nominally underneath the gap. And we're going to go through some examples of that in a few slides. Similarly, for the coordinates, should we be exposing something like an app relative coordinate versus screen or global coordinates? Kind of comes down to how convenient you want the API to be for developers and kind of how foolproof you want to make it. When we talk about screen global coordinates, there's always a question of how do you transform these into something that your app can understand in terms of where it wants to put content. And the third one is as I previously discussed, hinge angle, is this just a hardware sensor, or is there something more meaningful that can allow, apps across the device in different use cases to kind of respond in similar ways in a consistent manner? So when we're talking about apps just working and the content splitting versus, I guess you can't really see that on the size of this. Oh, do I have to accept? Oh, there. Thank you. Oh, a couple. All right. So here you can kind of see an example of how, an unenlightened app might split its text across the gap, whereas, an enlightened app obviously doesn't have that problem because it can place its content accordingly. And, in a different posture, perhaps, a document, since it's flowing vertically, doesn't even need to do any adjustment. This is another example that kind of highlights the splitting versus masking problem. You have your unenlightened app that's, some rich media content that is maybe an image or some video. By default, it's going to split, but, that kind of leaves some visual artifacts that may be undesirable. And so we believe exposing a way to kind of have things show up under the gap can kind of reduce this effect of an image being split, perhaps in a unfortunate location. And in this case, in another vertical portrait posture, you wouldn't want your content in this case to split over the gap. And so we believe developers should be able to react accordingly. So for web developers, these are kind of some of the thinking that we've had in terms of coming up with our proposal. We believe that spanning is kind of a new semantic window mode, similar to how on a traditional desktop you have your restored, maximized full screen state. We believe this spanning mode really does kind of reflect a user intent that content should be split across the various displays that are present. And similarly, we want developers to design layouts and experiences that are aware of where this hinge or gap exists in their app real estate. Web developers will require both a declarative CSS and a JavaScript API. Declarative CSS follows the responsive web principles and patterns where, we don't want to go back to the m.web where device-specific sites are served. And the JavaScript API, we believe, is, kind of gives a more flexible road forward for things like if you had canvas content that doesn't necessarily adhere to something like a declarative layout, that kind of gives you all the facilities you might need to respond to these different geometries. And I guess last but not least, this is probably the most important, enlightened sites must work consistently across browsers and devices. So this is really something we need to drive through the standards process, get the feedback there, respond accordingly, and so that developers can really have these primitives and mental model of how to reason about these consistently across devices. So when new devices come to market, they're not left worrying, is my code going to work across those? Just wanted to point out there are some existing proposals that are related to this space. So Google has been pushing some of these. Screen enumeration and window placement are kind of up and coming. And those kind of expose different aspects of what you might traditionally think is this dual screen, double display type device. So screen enumeration kind of exposes the hardware of your various displays. But again, this is kind of in that screen coordinate space. Window placement is more of a proactive thing on the behalf, it exposes an API that allows sites to be more proactive in terms of, I want to place content in this region, whereas the dual screen stuff that we're really talking about is more of a reactive to that new window mode that the window manager / user puts you in. And presentation API also kind of follows this window placement of, I want to stream content or maybe put a new document on a separate display. And so there's probably some overlap here, and we're kind of working with some of the folks working on these APIs to really tease out the common parts. But we still believe there's a separate concept here of like your app relative coordinate space. Here are interesting regions where you can place content. So let's go into some of the proposed APIs that we have so far. So for the CSS solution, we believe that a new media feature that can match in this new semantic mode is going to be useful for developers to target this specifically. And so in this case, your application is spanned, and you can target your CSS directly there. Additionally, we believe that exposing the geometry of the fold or the hinge, still working on kind of coming up with the appropriate naming here, is also a way that developers can write their content to look correct, regardless of whether or not these pixels show up behind the gap, because using calc expressions, etc., you can make it so that your content is appropriately split and takes into account where this gap is in viewport coordinates. Currently, our CSS solution is scoped to dual screen. We were kind of thinking long and hard about, can we make this more generic for end screens or n by n geometries? But kind of given the constraints of the CSS language, there's no if statements, for loops. We didn't really see a path forward there, and kind of following the existing model of when new form factors come online, web developers are already kind of known to target those. So like a new watch form factor comes online. Yes, it has a rectangular viewport of a certain size, but at the same time, developers that want experiences to really light up on these devices are already kind of looking at those. Additionally, we have a proposal for a JavaScript API, which is a little bit more flexible and we think kind of is a little more future-proof in terms of exposing arbitrary screens and layouts. But in this case, you would have two window segments that represent the regions of the window that reside in separate displays. And maybe it's something that a developer wants to change their CSS in reaction to these things changing, or maybe it's something like I mentioned before, like a canvas effect where in a game you can split your canvas appropriately and put certain controls in certain locations. There's a public explainer where we kind of gone a little bit more in depth in these, so please take a look and provide any feedback. Very, very welcome and appreciated. And then I kind of want to go over some of the open issues that we're struggling with in terms of tying the scenario together completely. So keyboard occlusion is one thing that we've heard from our customers that, hey, we need to go and solve this. So, on mobile, currently when your software keyboard shows up, there's kind of, I guess it's not just mobile, there's other desktop platforms that have software keyboards, but in general, there's kind of two approaches. It's either, the content is shifted up and then a visual viewport is applied to the remaining real estate. So the user can actually scroll through the entire page, but the layout space doesn't change. But there's also a resize that can happen. And I think that's what Chromium does on Android today. But if you apply that to the dual screen scenario, if, especially on the larger form factor, if your keyboard only shows up on one screen when it's docked, you kind of end up with this weird looking effect where there's just this blank space. So we believe it's possible that developers may want to opt into an overlay or occluding keyboard and get events in order to position their content. And at that point, they would kind of be in charge of ensuring that the focused element is viewable by the viewable and interactable with the user. Also, some other interesting issues that we've been working through. So iframe handling in general, we don't think by default iframes would be interested in this specific bit of information, since iframes are nominally components that the root embedder is kind of placing into its content. But we also think that maybe there are scenarios where developers would want this. So I guess our current proposal is iframes don't see this by default, but there's a feature policy that developers can opt into, and then kind of at that point, it's in the developer's hands in terms of providing the iframe with enough contextual information of how to transform these coordinates from the root coordinate space into their iframe. Another tricky problem that we're running into, which is kind of a known problem with, for example, the viewport units on mobile, is if you have a dynamic browser Chrome where it shows up when you first navigate and then as you scroll, it disappears. What happens in the case where you have this posture and the Chrome disappears? And in terms of relative to your layout viewport, the hinge or fold is actually moving. We don't have a great answer for what that looks like today, because intuition says, doing a layout for each frame that you're scrolling is probably not the right answer. And then there's also some questions about exotic form factors of, displays that don't quite match in geometry, either in one dimension or two dimensions. I think the fundamental principle there still applies of we would kind of rely on the window manager to provide the appropriate rectangular window/viewport. And we think like the window segments thing can definitely express various regions appropriately. But I think there's some concern there of, can it really handle all these different form factors? So that's pretty much it. If anyone has any questions, more than willing to go over some of those open issues, or if you guys want to discuss the API surface a little bit more in terms of how we've been thinking about it. Yeah, let me pass the mic around.
Yeah, a few questions. So it looks like it's mostly targeted for the foldable case, right?
Yes.
Because I see part of this API is interesting for, well, at least in my case, we are working with TV, but also with automotive, and the multiple screen case is quite frequent, but there are differences about you can have 2 screens with different resolutions, with different high DPI state, things like that. So I guess that on one side it makes sense for some views, like trying to mimic the one window thing span across different screens.
Mm-hmm.
But on that case, it looks hard to have different resolutions or having something different than a rectangle. But for the other case, I guess that it should be enough with the screen enumeration and being able to put different windows in different screens, I guess. Or even having desktop and a screen, Chromecast, and then you operate on the 2 screens, one of them with some kind of casting. Would that make sense? Are you considering this as part of the? Are you considering this as part of these explainers or not?
Yeah, I think the way that we're viewing it is things like the screen enumeration and window placement really are appropriate for these kind of disparate external monitor cases, because, as to the extent that the window manager supports a spanning mode is kind of what we're trying to expose. And so if you think of the case where you have 2 different sized monitors, if the window manager did support like the spanning mode where it's taking up all available space, you would still probably have a rectangular viewport of some sort. Like, I don't think there's any windowing model currently that you could have an L-shaped viewport or some disparate disjoint thing. And so for those cases, yeah, we definitely believe that screen enumeration, window placement, and presentation API are kind of the answers developers are looking for.
Okay, let's check later, because at least for the standard definition, maybe we could give some input to also cover a bit more of these cases. But it looks fine. I like it.
Great.
I just wanted to say that if you should also be careful about not making it too flexible, because like at the end of the day, developers will have to use this, and they're not testing on all kind of different devices, and making something that's generic enough that just automatically works everywhere never works out.
Yeah.
So
and that's definitely the approach we took towards the CSS side of things.
I really
think
like
the JavaScript API we're still kind of working through. Can it be flexible to kind of express a known set of things and have the API not be restrictive as new form factors come online? So
just be careful that it's not like opening up a can of worms so that developers will not know how to deal with it or test it.
Right. Yeah, definitely a concern. Yeah. If you open up an API surface that's not testable.
Regarding iframes, Chrome is getting portals, and even like first content portals, so you might actually have to look at that.
Yeah, I think I looked at portals briefly, and I think they respect the same feature policies and CSP directives. So
probably.
I think, in my mind, at least, it fits nicely into that. But certainly an area to make sure that we're keeping in mind as we go forward with this stuff.
Could you maybe just elaborate a little bit on what the challenges are with hiding URL bar? Is it just that like a developer wants to stick something in one screen, and so then when the URL bar hides, you want to keep it there?
It's more related to these environment variables that we think developers need in order to create these declarative layouts. And so this one probably doesn't show the effect, but you can imagine if your device is rotated, your URL bar shows in the top your fold top is then, you know, whatever offset from your viewport. And then as it scrolls up, it actually is changing position. And so, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a whiteboard over here. Is this a whiteboard?
Here as well. Yeah.
Ah, yeah. So
Yeah,
I
so-
guess it's kind of like as you're transitioning from something like this, where you have your URL bar here, and this is, you know, the top left 00 of your layout viewport, and as that thing disappears, this geometry is actually
Because of scrolling.
getting bigger.
Right. So I think we have very similar issues even just with one screen. And the way it seems to be handled, at least in Chrome, is we kind of lie to the web page for a little
Right.
bit. And so a lot of we play a little bit of like sleight of hand in the compositor, for example, to just keep things fixed to like an edge of a screen, even though technically it should be moving up. So I think you can do similar things here.
Yeah, I guess the concern is like if a website actually wanted to split its content exactly across these two, and this is its available space to do so on the top, then like what happens when it shifts up? Or if you're lying and you just use the geometry of when it's completely gone, then, you know, it doesn't really line up when you first load the page.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, obviously this is just me spitballing, but I would take a look at like position fixed, for example, because I think that's one way where that's the place kind of where we do a lot of this sleight of hand today. And so if you maybe define position fixed in a way that developers can use it like that, that might be one solution.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I know there's been some discussion on CSS working group about having two viewport units to kind of handle the single screen case where, you know, you have this geometry, this length is your viewport height. I forget which one is which, but there's a new unit that kind of describes what it would be once the thing is gone. And so, yeah, exactly. So working through some of that. Oh. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, hi. Sorry, I came in here a little bit late.
No
So
problem.
I saw the CSS version of this. There's other windowing APIs where you're like opening up windows and positioning in them and stuff.
Yes.
So as the person who owns the pop-up blocker, I am interested in this because what is the relationship between web pages opening windows and the pop-up blocker, which explicitly lives in order to prevent web pages from doing exactly that, and other APIs like window move to window movement stuff where we're investigating trying to remove those from the web platform because they're so easily abusable.
Yep. I will defer that to my colleague over here that's driving these APIs. Just for the proposals that we have, they're, again, very reactive in terms of this is a state that the user is putting the window into, and the window manager is exposing this information.
Sure.
It's not trying to, this specific proposal that we're looking at is not trying to place things. It's really about reacting to getting the window into this specific state. But Mike can probably speak to those a little bit more.
Yeah, so I am working on the screen enumeration and window placement proposals, which are, as Daniel said, related to this, and specifically about opening windows and using move to and resize to, etc. I think we should chat more. I think that there is an opportunity for sure to enable some important new use cases with also trying to maybe clamp down a little bit on some abusive behavior that is currently possible with those APIs. So I think that there is room there for some interesting solutions, and we should definitely chat more. Yeah. Great. Okay.
Questions?
All right, I guess we can end a bit early, but if you have any offline feedback, feel free to shoot me a mail or leave a GitHub issue on our explainer. I think we're trying to figure out how to move that out of there into the appropriate incubation place. So definitely keep you guys posted.
Yep. So far, like the GitHub issues is the best place to leave feedback for us. So we look forward to it.
Yeah.
Until we find the right working group, probably like second screen or something.
The CSS would obviously go
CSS,
on CSS,
yeah, for the
but,
CSS media query, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'll be a little bit of a longer road. So
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, to be transparent there, we think kind of the JavaScript API will probably be the V1 of like how developers can start reasoning about these primitives, and, you know, we'll hammer on the CSS and bike shed it and make sure it's just what everyone thinks is the right abstraction there. So, all right, thanks everyone.